You're listening to the Mezzo Guild podcast.
بس أنا لازم أحسه الأول عشان أقوله.
아직 나의 어색한 한국말이 짤따рат하고 지적하지 말아주세요.
Я хочу с тобой серьезно поговорить.
Really good news, Farragut. No, I can quit this Maldives a year short.
Language learning, made simple. Most of us eventually hit learning plateaus in our language learning. These are times where we feel like we're just not learning much anymore. Learning stops feeling like a rapid ascent, a rapid climb, and no matter how much study we do, it just seems like we're getting nowhere. When you've finished a book or a course and you hit a learning plateau, it can really leave you wondering, well, what do I do now? There's a pretty straightforward explanation for why this happens. We become proficient enough in the language and able to use it enough to achieve what we want or what we need that all of the gaps in our proficiency levels start to become less clear and less definable. Put simply, when I can't talk about what I did yesterday, I know that I need to learn the past tense. If I can't talk about what I'm going to do tomorrow, then I need to learn the future tense. It's more obvious when you're at a low level what needs to be learned and what doesn't. Everything is clear, everything is obvious. But when you're at a higher level, you know most of this stuff already. This doesn't mean you know it perfectly well by any means, but you know enough language to handle most situations. And this is where we reach higher level plateaus. So firstly, let me clear up one misconception. Fluent does not mean that you can talk about advanced topics. I'll say that again. Fluent does not mean that you can talk about advanced topics. I think the word advanced is almost as poorly defined and confusing for people as the word fluency. You can be very fluent in a language and still not be able to discuss a lot of advanced topics. Well, how so? I'll give you an example. My dad is totally computer illiterate. He's the kind of guy who needs help finding the power button on a computer. He knows nothing about computers. Now, I, on the other hand, am a bit of a nerd. I like programming, I use open source software, I do vector and web design, and so on. Now, if I talk to my dad about any of those things, if I tried to talk to my father about any of those topics, or on the same level that I would talk to another person who has the same interests as me, do you think that he would have a clue what I'm talking about? It would be like talking a foreign language to him. He would have no idea. So would it then be correct to say that I'm more fluent in English because I can talk about something that he can't? Not at all. We're both perfectly fluent native English speakers. So therefore, fluency has got nothing to do with the content of your conversations. And even if there are a bunch of topics that you can't talk about in a foreign language, it is not an indicator of your proficiency level in the language. You can be at a near native level fluency level in a foreign language and still unable to discuss a range of topics that you're unfamiliar with or not knowledgeable in. The key is in how you would respond to somebody who was talking with you about an advanced topic that you don't understand. Are you any less fluent if you choose easier words over others? For example, using look at instead of examine, talk to instead of discuss, fight instead of dispute or argument, and so on. Could you explain your political, religious, or social views in a much simpler way, even if you didn't know all of the terms? How about describing your feelings or your emotions? Think about people who live in lower socioeconomic areas of your own country, who aren't highly educated. How do they communicate with each other? Actually, the term lower socioeconomic is a good example. I know plenty of people back home who would not even know what that term means. They would use a simple word like poor instead, and they're just as fluent as I am. Now, as a language learning exercise, pick any advanced level conversation and see if you can reword that conversation using layman's terms. First in your native language and then in your foreign language. Knowledge of advanced content has nothing to do with your fluency level. Now, we become settled on comfortable ways of expressing things. Language learners develop habits over time. These aren't necessarily bad or wrong habits. We pick up certain ways of saying things that work well for us if they get whatever it is we want done. They achieve the goal we want, so we no longer see a need to improve on them. For example, in Arabic, there are so many ways to go about haggling prices in street markets. If you're going to buy vegetables in a stall, there's so many different ways to haggle prices. You could actually write a book on haggle slang in Egyptian Arabic. Now, since there is a verb that literally means to make something cheap or to make something cheaper in Arabic, rakhas, should a person just use that verb every single time? Should they just use rakhas every single time they want to ask somebody to make something cheaper? If it makes sense and works, why not? But what about the plethora of different ways that you could get the same point across? So, for example, instead of using that verb, why not use the verb which is to make something go down, to make something descend? Nazzal. Nazzal literally means to descend, or to make something descend or go down. So why not use that instead of rakhas? The point here is that it's very easy for a learner to develop a habit of using the same word or the same expressions every single time in the same situation. It gets comfortable. When I first arrived in Cairo many, many years ago, one of the first phrases I learned was, "Can you take me to?" "Mumkin takhudni ila?" So I would use that every single time I got into a taxi as a new learner. "Mumkin takhudni ila?" Somewhere. So the problem is native speakers rarely ever do this. They don't do this. If you've been to Cairo, you'll notice the native speaker would just say, "Al-Maadi?" They just yell out the place. So, I'd be standing there saying, "Mumkin takhudni ila al-Maadi?" Whereas a normal person would just be like, "Maadi?" Just yell it out. So even though it's not incorrect and it gets the job done, there are far better ways to handle the situation. There are more natural ways to handle the situation. Taxi drivers don't have time to sit there and listen to you speak that long-winded shite on a busy street when they want to keep moving. They're in a rush. And it requires a real conscious effort on our part as learners to stop and think about what we're saying and whether or not there are other better ways to say it. Always be attentive to the way that native speakers do it. When we talk about improving at high levels, what we actually want to do is find better or more appropriate ways to say the things that we already know. So as a high-level learner of Arabic, how do I do this? Well, in addition to taking private lessons a few times a week, there are usually two things that I do to improve my current level. Now, I'm at a high level. One is a self-learning exercise, and the other is more of a social exercise. The first one is that I do a lot of dissecting video and audio content. Now, it can be quite tedious if I spend too much time doing it, but this helps me immensely in small portions. And I use talk shows on CBC, which is a popular station in Egypt. Now, talk shows or interview shows are the best source to use, in my opinion, because they're so natural, they're unscripted, but they're usually easy to follow because they're on a particular topic. I don't like to use films for this reason. Listening to real people interact on a talk show or in an interview allows you to really hear how language is naturally used between two or more people, and it generally stays right on topic. And what I do is I save a YouTube file to my computer, which, so I can easily rewind it, pause it, cut the file if I want to do a bit of editing. Using one of the many different ways of downloading YouTube videos. There are different plugins, there are sites where you can do it, and I choose an interesting but very brief 1-minute segment of the interview. So I don't try and listen to the whole thing because you're not going to learn anything. You're trying to fit too much into a study period. So I'll take one small chunk of the video, and I listen to that segment dozens or even hundreds of times over until I can almost repeat it verbatim. I then take whatever new words and expressions I can get out of it, and I store them on a flashcard program like Anki, which is one of the several great flashcard programs. Once I'm done with Anki, I can export the Anki file to Dropbox and then import it to my Android device. Now, there are two difficulties I face doing this. Number one is that it's not always possible to find colloquial expressions or vocab definitions online. And this is an even bigger problem for languages like Arabic, where dialect material is scarce. Number two is that a lot of the new expressions I hear are unable to be translated literally and make no sense to outsiders. This is one of the biggest challenges for higher level learners in that there are lots of idiomatic expressions which really can't literally be translated or understood without an explanation. And a lot of them, you need to be in the country to really find out what they mean, because they change a lot. They adapt to the culture, they adapt to the times, and it does help to be aware of what's happening in the country. So because of this, it's really essential that I take notes on the segment and then show them to my private tutor. The next time that I see him or her, who they will often say things to me like, "Oh man, this is a really slang expression. Where did you hear it?" I recently watched an interview where a woman uses an array of descriptive language taken from a classic novel, and a lot of it's just baffled me. A lot of it was just there was no way I could figure it out, and I searched online, couldn't find a lot of the stuff she was talking about. Couldn't find an answer for it anywhere. So having a teacher is really vital to getting explanations for things like that. And this is something that you can find a tool like italki very useful for if you don't have access to local teachers or practice partners. The most important thing is that whatever I learn on my own by watching or listening to something, I put it into practice as soon as possible. You have to do this. You have to take it from passive knowledge to active knowledge. You really have to do that. Memorizing flashcards is a pointless exercise if you don't use what you're learning. And I like to think of my goal as being 10% study time, and the other 90% of my time is practicing and using what I covered in that 10% of my time. That really is the best ratio, and you should be using what you've learned most of the time. Now, I would advise you to prepare for real situations and take advantage of them if you can. To give you an example, when I was in Egypt recently, I had a huge rip on a pair of good shorts. And I was going to throw them in the bin, but I saw it as a really great opportunity for me to improve my Arabic and learn new things because there happened to be a tailor on my street. And this is a particular topic that I don't really know how to discuss very well. It's not something I've really ever needed. So I learned new words and expressions to do with mending clothes. And what I did was I went down to one of the local tailors, and got my shorts mended. Now, of course, this is something that I could have done without any problems anyway, but I could already speak fluently with the guy and get the job done without having to learn anything new. That would have been no problem, but it would have wasted an opportunity to improve on a topic that I didn't really know. So it would be far better for me to use opportunities like these to pick up profession-specific terms and find out exactly how native speakers deal with clothing repair alterations and so on. Sometimes you don't even need to learn new vocab or expressions. You might just have to discover, exactly how a native speaker would ask for something, using words that you already know. There might just be some specific way that a native speaker does it, and it's up to you to find out how that is. So the lessons that I have with my private tutors are all highly practical, situational lessons. Always. We pick real situations. My tutors teach me a bunch of local expressions and terms that I can use, a lot of which aren't covered by textbooks because they're very, very colloquial. And then we just role play them. And after the lesson, I head off and I use it as soon as possible. This is something, by the way, that I did in the Middle East and when I'm at home. Now, this doesn't have to be situations that are unfamiliar. Think about all the things that you already talk about in a foreign language and ask yourself how you can improve on those things. Another example was a lesson that I had a while back on how to improve my conversation with the butcher when I was in Cairo, and all the different meat cuts, how to request lean meat, minced meat, breast, chops, portions, and so on. It's a really super specific lesson. It's really super specific. And it honestly, it amazed me how many local expressions there were for that one situation that I didn't know. And this is an example. If you're living in a place especially, it's amazing what you can learn if you get a lesson that is that targeted. If you're stuck on a learning plateau, just open your mind to the almost infinite amount of different situational expressions that you could work on improving. Now, I'll just make one final note on textbooks for higher level learners. Now, I've been using some great advanced books for Arabic from the AUC, from the American University in Cairo. And one thing that they have in common is that they address real-world issues through the target language. This means that they focus on getting you to think about serious topics that will require you to use new terms and expressions. They equip you with the expressions and the terms that you need, and then through reading and video content, you're able to see and hear and apply them through interaction. Now, language learning, in a sense, then becomes incidental to serious, interesting discussion, rather than the other way around. The thing I like about these kinds of books is that you can use them on your own or use them as points of discussion with language exchange partners or in a classroom. The point is that they're not just teaching you language in isolation. And a lot of textbooks will run through chapter by chapter analysis of advanced grammar, isolated word lists, and so on. These kinds of books will interest some people, but there's really little value in them for improving conversation skills overall. Now, it's of course not possible for me to address individual languages and what books are available here, but it's something for you to keep in mind when looking for a text to work with. Well, that's it, folks. I hope I've given you some new ideas to think about if you're trying to improve at a high level. If you'd like to chime in on this and add your thoughts, then just head over to the URL that's in the podcast notes and drop a comment.